Well, thank you for joining me today as we're going to talk about Tier 4 diesel engine regulations. I am Eric Bjornstad with Bell Performance. And so the first thing, in order to kick this discussion off, we have to consider the question of what is Tier 4? What do we mean when we talk about that? Well, Tier 4 refers to a generation of federal air emission standards that were established by the U.S. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and these standards apply to new diesel engines that are used in off-road equipment. Now, essentially what Tier 4 does is it requires manufacturers, diesel engine manufacturers, to reduce the levels of emissions. That's particulate matter and also what they call NOx, NOx, oxides of nitrogen. And they have to reduce those levels to 50 to 96% lower than the previous generations of diesel engines, which are Tier 3. Now, it's important to note that Tier 4 emissions requirements, those apply to new diesel engine products only. They do not apply retroactively to any existing diesel engines or equipment. And the EPA in California, as what tends to happen, they have tended to adopt the same standards. How it typically goes is California leads the way, and then the EPA kind of looks at them and say, hey, we'll do what they're doing. So the EPA in California have adopted the same standards, so there are no unique Tier 4 diesel emission standards that apply, let's say, in the state of California itself. So why did these changes come about? Why are these changes being made? Well, you have the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Air Act, through that, the EPA establishes national clean air standards. And those clean air standards help determine the levels of allowable emissions that are going into the air, things like ozone, fine particulates, NOx, SOx, stuff like that. Now, from that, the sources of these emissions, which tend to be cars and trucks and tractors and power plants and other industrial engines, these sources are then regulated by the EPA and in the state of California, the California Air Resources Board, or what they call CARB. These sources are regulated to control the volume and the types of emissions to make sure that they meet the Clean Air Act and the National Clean Air Standards. Now, each state or regional area in the United States with levels of emissions that exceed the National Clean Air Standards are required to develop a plan to improve air quality and meet the clean air requirements established by the EPA. So that, in a nutshell, is the basis or the rationale for this whole Tier 4 diesel engine requirement. So in order to understand it, let's talk a little bit about past history. Past history, Tiers 1, 2, and 3. Now, Tier 4 standards, they provide manufacturers with what they call a flexibility provision, and they include an interim step, what they might call a Tier 4 interim, which requires a substantial reduction in particulate matter emissions and yet also gives them flexibility in lowering NOx emissions. And so after Tier 4 interim comes Tier 4 final, which includes additional reductions in NOx and hydrocarbons emissions. So you might think, okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but the reason why we're mentioning, Tier 4 interim and Tier 4 final step, the reason why we're mentioning those is because they didn't just jump to Tier 4 out of the blue. They had to work their way through previous lower tiers in order to get up to this point. So when you start with Tier 0. There have always been these engines known as Tier 0 engines, and they have no modern emissions control systems, and so they're usually referred to as unregulated. And they're likely to be a mechanically controlled engine rather than an electronically controlled one. So you start off with Tier 0, and then each progression of standard level, Tier 0 goes to Tier 1, and then it goes to Tier 2, and then it goes to Tier 3. These engines all have been lower in emissions, and they've all been more advanced technologically than the previous generation before them. And in order to accomplish that, you've got things like the use of electronic engine controls. They've developed new higher pressure fuel injection systems, advanced turbocharging. These are all technologies that have been developed by the industry to help diesel engines meet these new tier requirements and reduce emissions, while at the same time not compromising performance. So on August 27th, 1998, the EPA signs the final rule that introduces Tier 1 standards for diesel engine equipment, and it's not all diesel engine because they do recognize that there's a difference in sizes. So the 1998, they say Tier 1 is going to apply to engines under 50 horsepower, or 37 kilowatts, as they call them. And then it says, but by the way, there's going to be more stringent Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards that are going to be phased in for all equipment in coming years. And by coming years, they meant 2000 to 2008. So the 1998 rule extended the Tier 1 requirements to include small diesel engines, while also scheduling the phase-in of more strict Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards for all diesel engines within the next 10 years after that. So we go now to 2004, May 11th, 2004. The EPA signs another final rule that introduces Tier 4 emission standards to be phased in over the period 2008 to 2015, as you see on your screen. Now, as we noted in the very beginning, the Tier 4 standards require that emissions come out of these diesel engines, specifically of particulate matter and NOx. They require them to be further reduced over Tier 2 and Tier 3 by about 90%. Now, as we mentioned, a couple minutes ago, in order to help this process along, they actually introduced an interim standard first. Sometimes you might see it referred to as Tier 4I or Tier 4 interim. And, of course, they had to do that because it was a really dramatic change, and it's really hard to introduce such a dramatic change without giving a period for industry in the marketplace to kind of phase the changes in. So the emission standard becomes effective on January 1st, 2011. And this applies to all new high horsepower diesel generator engines. The Tier 4I, Tier 4 interim, that standard significantly cut NOx emissions, and it expanded operational flexibility to also include non-emergency use exceptions that these diesel engines could use and still achieve Tier 4I certification. Then the final standard, which is simply called Tier 4, they don't typically call it Tier 4 Final or Tier 4F, they just say Tier 4. This final standard retained the interim standard's emission cuts for NOx, but now introduced an additional thing, an additional significant reduction in particulate matter emissions. And the EPA began issuing Tier 4 certifications in January of 2014. So, according to this final rule, this Tier 4 final rule that the EPA issued these 2014 certifications on, according to this, the majority of diesel engines, and that includes both off-road and on-road, majority of diesel engines sold in the United States and Japan and most of Europe, they will have to meet the most strict exhaust emission standards yet. In order to meet those standards, manufacturers figured out that they had to outfit these engines with a variety of new exhaust after-treatment components. And the ramp-up to this was kind of gradual. The Tier 3 standards were phased in between 2006 to 2008. Tier 4 interim was between 2008 and 2012. And then now we have Tier 4 final. So the non-road standards cover mobile non-road diesel engines of all sizes used in a wide range of construction and agricultural and industrial equipment. but the non-road diesel emission standards are not applicable to all non-road diesel engines. Um, you know, we've said a lot of things, and if you're not familiar with this, all this may start to kind of run together. You know, it applies to this and not to that, and this, that, and whatever. So let's see if we can state this a little bit more clearly. You know, these Tier 4 standards did not apply equally to every kind of diesel engine. So we say there are or were certain exceptions that were kind of drafted into the requirement. So what are those exceptions? Well, there's four main exceptions. This is what we're talking about when you see on your screen exemptions for certain non-road engines. So those exemptions. Exemption number one, engines used in locomotives. Those did not fall under these Tier 4 final regs because locomotives have their own completely separate EPA regulations that they have to meet. So locomotives were accepted. Marine vessels, diesel engines used in marine vessels are also covered by a separate EPA regulation. And so these marine diesel engines are not subject to the same kind of Tier 4 regulations as other diesels were. Third one, underground mining equipment. You have the Mining Safety and Health Administration. They have their own rules that cover diesel emissions and air quality in mines. So they're not covered by Tier 4 either. And then the final one that was exempted from Tier 4 are small diesel hobby engines, specifically defined as less than 50 cubic centimeters per cylinder. So other than those four, locomotives and marine and underground mining and small hobby engines, everything else is covered by this new Tier 4 final emissions regulation. So you've got this situation where they're saying, okay, we're going to phase in these regs over about a 3-year period. And anytime you require such a significant upgrade, the question always comes up, how are these phased-in regulations going to apply to engines that are already out there, right? Because we already said Tier 4 was only intended to apply to new diesel engines. So every new diesel engine that's sold is going to have things that help it meet this Tier 4 regs, but there's a lot of diesel engines already out there. What are they going to do with those? Are they going to outlaw them or something? Well, no, of course they're not going to do that. Well, according to federal law and the applicable EPA regs, depending on the machine, manufacturers will typically only be able to produce Tier 4 engines after the established deadlines. That's what we were talking about. However, if they had existing inventories of Tier 3 engines and Tier 3 equipment, well, they were allowed to keep selling those until they got their inventory depleted. And they also have slightly different rules for diesel engines that are slated for export outside the United States. Okay, so they can sell off what they got. That's fine. What about, is there going to be a phase-out period for engines, or are they going to grandfather in all the old diesel engines? And if they're not going to have some kind of grandfather clause, are they going to compensate people? Are they going to take away their diesel engines? And the answer to that is, look, the Tier 4 requirements, again, only apply to new diesel engines, no matter if they're sold in California or Minnesota or New York or, anywhere. It's only new diesel engines. And there's no federal requirement to upgrade any existing engine to the new Tier 4 standards. And so the industry or the marketplace says, okay, that's good news for us. So we have said that the big thing that Tier 4 did was it would significantly, dramatically or drastically reduced the allowable emissions. What kind of levels are we talking about here? Well, on the screen here, you can see a comparison in different kinds of emissions levels. NOx and HC, which is unburned hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, which is always bad, that's indicative of incomplete combustion, and PM, particulate matter. And you can see how these standards, the allowable standards for these different ones, was dramatically reduced in Tier 4. I mean, if you look at for Tiers 1, 2, and 3, NOx was 9.2, and I forget what the units are. I mean, we could call them something like I don't know, grams per kilowatt hour or whatever. Use whatever unit you want, because it's conceptually you can see how they've been removed, and the exact units are not essential to understanding this. So under the old tiers 1, 2, and 3, you could have 9.2 for NOx, you could have 1.3 for hydrocarbons. Carbon monoxide, it varied depending on the engine, but it was anywhere from 3.5 to as high as 11.4. And then 1.45 for particulate matter. And what you can see is that the interim really slashed NOx, down to between, 0.6 to 3.5. Unburned hydrocarbons were reduced, pretty dramatically by like 70%. Carbon monoxide was reduced down to 3.5. Particulate matter was reduced by like 90-something%. And then the Tier 4 finals, you can see the Tier 4 final ones, now that we are all under Tier 4, NOx emissions are limited to 0.67 grams per kilowatt hour. Hydrocarbons, unburned hydrocarbons, are reduced to less than 0.2. So that's more than a 90% reduction. Carbon monoxide is 3.5. Particulate matter is 0.03. That's huge. That's a huge, pretty dramatic reduction there. So how did, in order to meet these drastic changes in these emissions, they're going to have to change the engine designs. How are they going to do that? What kinds of things did the marketplace do in order to help them meet these changes? Each manufacturer was basically free to pursue their own technology path, so to speak, their own emissions compliance strategy. The government basically said, we don't care how you do it, you just need to do it. And so the marketplace did what it had to do. And as a result, there were a number of new technologies that were developed for use on the Tier 4 engines and equipment to help them meet these requirements. Now, in the past, when they were trying to meet Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards, they developed things like the high-pressure common rail fuel injection system. They developed electronically controlled injector solenoids. They developed advanced turbocharging. Now, these improvements enabled the engine manufacturers to meet Tier 2 and Tier 3 standards, but they were not going to be enough to help them meet Tier 4. And so what the marketplace, what the diesel engine manufacturers figured out was that they were really going to have to target exhaust after treatment, doing something with the post-combustion products that were being produced by the engine. So what they did is they developed a number of technologies. You can see the acronyms on your screen. You can see SCR, you can see EGR, you can see DEF, and you can see DPF. So let's talk about each of these. Okay, let's start with EGR systems. Now, some Tier 4 engines started to use cooled exhaust gas recirculation. That's what EGR is, exhaust gas circulation. Now, EGR is a technique that recirculates a portion of the exhaust gases back, from the post-combustion area back into the combustion chamber. And what that does, it has an effect. It actually lowers the combustion temperature in the combustion chamber and thus reduces the formation of NOx gases. Now, the reason why doing that reduces NOx is because NOx, the formation of NO3 from NO2, that is a temperature-dependent reaction. It requires a lot of heat in order to take that extra oxygen from the air and slap it onto the NO2. So if you can cool the combustion chamber down, you're going to produce less NOx. That's basically the summary of why that's important. So they changed the design of the engine. They added extra manifolds and a little bit extra plumbing around the engine to help them do that. And so you have an EGR circuit. The EGR circuit itself, mechanically, is a relatively simple fix. You have an EGR valve that's controlled by the electronic control module in the engine, the computer. So you have that, but otherwise it's just a plumbing change, basically. Now, if they were to take hot exhaust gas, exhaust gases by themselves are hot. If they were to take those and pipe them back in, well, they wouldn't reduce the temperature in the cylinder. They would actually increase it because the gases are hot. So they figured out that they had to run the recirculated exhaust gas through a cooling unit first. So they also had to increase the engine's overall cooling system sizes to help enable them to do that as well. So that's EGR. The next thing they did, we won't say the next, we'll say another thing that they did was they produced SCR and DEF systems. So you have Tier 4 final regs. They call for a drastic cut in NOx levels. Now, in most engines, the sheer size of the drop that was being mandated was actually more than EGR alone could handle. So they figured out that in addition to EGR, they had to make these new systems called selective catalytic reduction, and that's when you see SCR, that's what it means, selective catalytic reduction. Now, SCR was already widely used in Europe on heavy-duty trucks, and it was also already in use in the U.S. on some stationary industrial engines and in power gen settings. But when you talk about mobile and on-road, cars and trucks, or trucks mainly, but mobile on-road and off-road applications, prior to around 2010, they didn't really have SCR, and so the majority of heavy-duty truck manufacturers actually started using SCR in between, say, 2010, 2011. Now, what happens in an SCR system? You have the exhaust gas, so the fuel's already been combusted, and the exhaust gas goes through a DPF system or a DPF slash DOC system. And so it goes through that first, and we'll talk about what those specifically do next. But for our purposes, to understand how SCR works, they've gone through the DPF. Those systems have cleaned it up a little bit. So then it passes through those, and then what the SCR does is it douses the exhaust gas with a mixture of water and urea. And this happens within a catalytic chamber. This urea water solution or mixture is what is commonly referred to as diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF. So when you hear the DEF system, this is what they're talking about. And so the DEF and the exhaust, they combine. There's a reaction that happens, and the NOx that's in there gets split apart and turned into water and nitrogen, which are perfectly harmless things for the environment. Yay. So having a DEF system and an SCR system, it increases the complexity of the engine, but it does have several advantages that goes along with it. The big one, of course, is that the engine can actually meet the emission standards, and they don't have to use as much EGR, so it helps increase the performance of the engine. The disadvantage of SCR is that you now have an additional consumable that you have to take into account. You have diesel exhaust fluid, and so these people who own these diesel engines, they're going to have to refuel their DEF tanks just like they would have to refuel their fuel tanks. And if you run out of DEF, the engines can be programmed to derate, eventually to the point where you can't go very fast, because they don't want you driving around without your DEF and your SCR system cleaning up the exhaust. So how much DEF, how much DEF do they use? Well, the typical range is that about 3 to 6% of the diesel fuel consumption by volume will be DEF. So if you use If you burn 200 gallons of diesel fuel, let's say you're going 700 or 800 miles, and you burn 200 gallons of diesel fuel, you're going to also end up burning 6 to 12 gallons of DEF. But since DEF is pretty cheap, it adds a little bit of extra cost, but it is really cheap. So it's a little bit extra cost, but over time, most consumers kind of get used to that, and it becomes an absorbed cost for them. All right, we mentioned DPF and DOC systems. So another way that manufacturers figured out to reduce exhaust pollutants was the use of diesel oxidation catalyst, DOC. A diesel oxidation catalyst is a filter, and it has a catalytic coating that's on the filter media. And much like the catalytic converter in a car, the catalyst on a DOC system, it chemically changes the carbon monoxide and the hydrocarbons and the particulates in the exhaust. It changes them into carbon dioxide plus water. Now, in some diesel engines, they have a diesel oxidation catalyst that's used in conjunction with the DPF. But in many lower horsepower diesel engines, they don't need to use both of those. They can just use the diesel oxidation catalyst. So in order to bring particulate matter levels down to acceptable levels in the higher horsepower engines, back when they were running Tier 3, that was when a lot of manufacturers figured out that they had to start using this technology called diesel particulate filter, or DPF. And a DPF filter is it's a ceramic filter. It's kind of honeycombed, and the honeycomb is coated with precious metal catalysts, and they trap particulate matter from the exhaust stream. They trap it in the filter. That's why it is a diesel particulate filter. It filters out diesel particulate. Now, under normal operating conditions, when you have hot exhaust gas running through this honeycomb, that honeycomb is going to get really hot, and it's going to get hot enough that the trapped particulate matter is actually going to get burned off or more fully combusted while it's trapped in this hot system. So it's going to take care of itself to a certain extent. But if you have driving conditions where you do a lot of idling, or you have a lot of cold starts, or if you're running a lot of that light load, that can actually increase the accumulation of particulate matter. And it can cause the DPF filter to fill up eventually. When this happens, the system recognizes this, and it actually undergoes a regeneration cycle where the engine control module it takes a stream of diesel fuel and actually injects diesel fuel into the DPF, which raises the temperature even more and burns off more of the accumulated particulate matter. Now, on most systems, this regeneration, it happens automatically, and the operator doesn't really need to do anything. There are other systems where they have a warning light that comes on that lets the operator know that they need to activate the regen system themselves. And regeneration, one thing to consider is that regeneration, it temporarily raises exhaust temperatures, which means, and this is more of a safety concern, the operator needs to know they should not engage in a regeneration cycle if they're around combustible material because, bad things can happen. So eventually, over time, you'll have ash that builds up in the DPF. Now, ash is not going to burn off because ash doesn't have carbon in it. So ash, eventually over time collects in the DPF, and there will come a point where the DPF will have to be taken off and cleaned. Typically, the EPA wants DPFs to go at least 4,500 hours of operation between cleaning. That's for larger engines. For diesel engines that are below, let's say, 175 horsepower, they get a shorter interval of about 3,000 hours. Okay, and then the last thing that changed with respect to engine designs is they have these new electronic controls. Now, most Tier 4 engines, well, we should say pretty much all Tier 4 engines, are going to be electronically controlled. So they have a computer, and the computer monitors conditions, monitors everything that's going on, and it adjusts. It makes all sorts of adjustments, like adjusts the fuel-air mixture to optimize the emissions that are being produced and to give the best combination of high performance and good emissions. That's one of the things the computer does. So virtually all Tier 4 engines have that. And then last major component that they figured out that they really needed to have with these Tier 4 engines is what they call an engine control unit, an ECU. Now, the ECU goes one step further. It manages literally dozens of operating and environmental conditions. Again, like we talked about with computers, the goal of the ECU is to optimize the combination of performance, horsepower and torque, how the engine responds to changes in load. Now, it's optimizing that because it wants to have the engine have as high a combustion efficiency over as broad a range of operating conditions as possible, because if you do that, you will by nature minimize emissions at the same time. So the ECU's job is to try and keep adjusting things in real time so that the engine operates to the best of its ability as cleanly as possible. Now, while exhaust remediation technologies have proven, pretty much essential in order to enable these new diesel engines to meet Tier 4 requirements, they are not the only necessary change that was made to the engines. They had to change other aspects of it in order for the engine to not only meet emissions exhaust requirements, but also to maintain the expected power and mileage performance. The marketplace did not want to be saddled with clean diesel engines that were poor performing. And so the diesel engine manufacturers tried to solve that problem. Now, to provide better combustion and better throttle response, more power, engine manufacturers fine-tuned the fuel-air mixtures with a variety of turbocharger designs. They introduced twin turbochargers. They changed the geometry or introduced what they call variable geometry turbochargers. They also pretty much made it a standard across the industry that diesel fuel systems went to the high-pressure common rail. High-pressure common rail design has much higher injector pressures, up to 30,000 psi. They changed the way the fuel was injected in the combustion chambers. I mean, common rail diesel engines really are remarkable engineering feats. And of course, they all introduced electronic engine control modules to increase the precision where all this stuff happening. Another thing they did was, in order to accommodate all of these changes, like, remember, the EGR circulation and that extra plumbing that they had to do. In order to accommodate all of that, diesel engines had to get larger. And so the physical size of the Tier 4 engines is bigger than previous engines, because you have after treatment systems with the DEF tank, you have larger radiators, you have changes to the filter systems, you have more plumbing, so to speak. Now, typically, you need a bigger engine to get the same horsepower rating as a non-Tier 4 engine. Remember, the engine manufacturers knew that the marketplace did not want a significant drop-off in power and performance. They're fine with all this extra stuff in a Tier 4 engine as long as it did not compromise the performance of the engine. And so they had to make engines bigger in order to accomplish that goal. And there's a number from an engineering standpoint. There's a number of reasons why size played into this. Maybe just one of them you could pick out is, you had certain things that the engine had to have a better cooling system, which meant you have to have a better fan drive system, which means you're going to lose some of the horsepower of the engine because that's going to get siphoned off operating the fan. So you have to increase the size of the engine in order to make up for that lost horsepower. And speaking of Tier 4 engines, running hotter, the pure temperature that's involved with a Tier 4 engine can affect wiring, And we never think of things like wiring, stuff like that. So in order to make sure all that stuff didn't get fried, they had to introduce new heat shielding into the engines as well to eliminate that as an issue. All right, so we have said all of that. We talked about how the engines have changed, the new exhaust, emissions cleanup technologies, and how they work. We have covered all of that. Now we get down to just how well do these work, so to speak. What are the environmental benefits of having all of these requirements for diesel engines? Because if you think about it, politically in this country there's small government, there's big government, and there's people who really don't like the government mandating what they what they can and cannot do. And when it comes down to it, this is a case of the government identifying something and saying this is a good thing. Cleaning up the environment is a good thing, and we're going to force people to fall in line. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's a debate for another day. But in the end, that is the rationale. So, what are the environmental benefits? They say they're doing it for the good of the environment. What are the environmental benefits? All right, so we know that Tier 4 engines, they're expected to reduce two key pollutants: particulate matter, number one; nitrogen oxides, number two. They wanted to reduce those because they affect people's health adversely. NOx, nitrogen oxides, contributes to the formation of ground-level ozone, which is a component of urban smog. It's really bad for lungs, especially the lungs of children. Then particulate, PM exposure to fine particulates in the air, definitely has adverse health effects on the respiratory system. Now, what positive effects historically have Tier 1 through 4 requirements had on the environment? Well, if you go all the way back to when we first started, we talked about 1998. And 1998 laid the groundwork, the regulation laid the groundwork for Tiers 1 and 2 and 3. Now, when they signed the 1998 rule, the EPA estimated, they were projecting into the future, and they estimated that over the next 12 years, by 2010, NOx emissions would be reduced across the country by 1 million tons a year. Now, 1 million tons doesn't mean anything to most people. It's just a number. So if we put it in context, 1 million tons per year, and that's per year, that's not cumulative. 1 million tons per year is the equivalent of taking 35 million passenger cars off the road. That's how much NOx they were going to save with just Tier 1, 2, and 3 requirements. But how much is it going to cost them to do that? There's always a cost associated with these things. Well, they estimated that the cost of meeting the emission standards would add a little less than 1% to the purchase price of typical non-road, that's generators, not talking about big rigs, typical non-road diesel equipment. It might be as high as 2 to 3% for some equipment. Comes out to about a cost of about $600 per ton of NOx reduced. That's the cost. Now, we'll go to Tier 4. When the full inventory of older non-road engines is replaced by Tier 4 engines, now that's an important stipulation because remember, there are all these old Tier 1, 2, 3 engines that are on the road. You're not going to be able to get them off. When we eventually reach a point where they have aged out, so to speak, the annual emissions reductions are going to be estimated at about 738,000 tons of NOx reduced per year and about just short of 130,000 tons of particulate matter. Now, when they're equating this to human life, they estimate that by 2030, we'll be at a point where we'll be saving about 12,000 premature deaths, which would have been prevented every year because of the implementations of these proposed standards. Now, how much is it going to cost to implement these Tier 4 standards? Well, estimated costs for adding these extra emissions control systems were between 1% and 3% of the total equipment price. So if you have a bulldozer, 175 horsepower bulldozer, might cost you $230,000 new. Well, the extra emissions control equipment is going to add another $7,000 to that price. So it's going to go from 230 to 237,000. So, is there anything after Tier 4? Have we reached the terminal point? Well, I was going to say we'd never reach the terminal point, but maybe a better way of saying it is, is there anything after Tier 4? Why, yes, there is. Right now, as of 2016, well, I should say back in 2016. They were already in the European Union. They were already talking about finalizing Stage 5 regulations, with planned implementation for those in the EU somewhere in 2019 or 2020. And of course, because Europe's doing it, that spawned discussions in the United States because so many OEMs, so many engine manufacturers here in the United States export their diesel engines into Europe. And if Europe has a Tier 5 standard, then they're not going to be able to sell United States engines that don't meet those standards. So for that reason, the European standards will likely eventually be adopted here in the United States, and they will, of course, be known as Tier 5. So what's going to be the likely changes? Well, they're anticipating that the Tier 5 regs are going to be relatively easy to meet with the technology that's already available today. In other words, it's not going to be as drastic a change going from Tier 4 to Tier 5 as it was going from Tier 3 to Tier 4. Now, what Tier 5 is going to concentrate on, what the regulators want, is they want more stringent control of these ultra-fine particles of soot that happen in diesel exhaust. And by ultra-fine, we're talking about what they call sub-micron levels. Because anytime you're talking about particulate matter, it's always a distribution of sizes. There's big particles, and there's medium particles, and there's small particles. And they've done a good job of reducing the larger particles. But now they're saying, okay, what about these really, really small sub-micron particles? Those are the ones that are considered really the greatest threat to lung health because of their size, they can lodge deeper inside the lung tissue and they can stay there. And really, they're just getting a handle on how serious a problem those sub-micron ultrafine particles can be. Well, luckily, they know that a BPF system can reduce or remove a lot of these particles. So what's likely to happen is that once they implement Tier 5, they will be requiring DPF on every diesel engine, large or small, stationary or mobile, including diesel engines that are the smaller ones, the less than 24 horsepower ones that currently are exempt from Tier 4 requirements. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is our overview of Tier 4 engine standards. I hope that you have found it useful and informative. Again, if you have any questions, you can email me at Bell Performance. My email address is ebjornstad. That's EBJORNSTAD at bellperformance.net. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.